welcome everybody. We were going over where everybody's from. We have people from England, the Netherlands, Italy, all over the U.S. And in the course, we have people from Canada, Ireland. I forgot Wendy, I'm sorry. We have people from Canada and Eastern Europe and other places in Europe and in Asia as well. So that's great. Okay, so we've had enough time sitting on the housekeeping. I'm going to go over to the front page and I'm going to start the course. And as you remember, we record these things and eventually get them up on the Parapsychology Foundation YouTube channel. So that's what all the formality will be about at the beginning. As soon as I'm finished with a description of the book and the biographies and reading them into the record, then we will land on the page with the questions and I will get out of the way and then Julia and Imants can take over. So welcome everybody to Parapsychology Foundation Presents Book Expo November 2016. Today is November 12th and we are in our very first Saturday, November 12th. We're in our very first, it's been a tough week, guys. We're in our very first session of the Book Expo, and we're very lucky today to have 5 speakers, Dr. Imants Baruss, Dr. Julian Mossbridge, who you'll see in a minute, both of them, and Tita Srivas, Rudolf Schmidt, and Dr. Renate Vrard. So in this presentation, we have Dr. Baruss and Dr. Mossbridge. Dr. Baruss is a professor of psychology at King's University College at Western University, Canada, where he has been teaching undergraduate courses about consciousness for 29 years. His research has been focused on the fundamental nature of consciousness, and he has had academic papers published not only in consciousness journals, but also in psychology, philosophy, physics, mathematics, anthropology, and other science journals. He is the author of 5 previous books, including Authentic Knowing, The Convergence of Science and Spiritual Aspirations, and Alterations of Consciousness, and Empirical Analysis for Social Scientists. Dr. Julian Mossbridge is an experimental psychologist and cognitive neuroscientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences in California, and a visiting scholar in psychology at Northwestern University in Chicago. She pursues, actually in Evanston, but I lived about a block below Northwestern in Chicago, so I always think of it as Chicago. Dr. Mossbridge pursues an understanding of time, especially in terms of the relationships between conscious and non-conscious processing of events. In 2014, she received the Charles Honorton Integrative Contributions Award for her work in bringing the phenomena of presentiment to the mainstream. And if you know anything about Charles Honorton, this is a very important award in the Parapsychological Association and one that is not given lightly. So we congratulate her on that. Dr. Mossbridge is the author of Unfolding, The Science of Your Soul's Work, and the upcoming mystical philosophical adventure, The Garden, an Insight Experiment. She also has a wonderful series on YouTube, so you should look for her there. The book they're going to be discussing today is Transcendent Mind, Rethinking the Science of Consciousness. This book was published by the American Psychological Association, which for a lot of us sounds like a miracle, and we're grateful that they were so interested in this book that they published it. This is absolutely wonderful for the field and for the discipline. Everyone knows that consciousness resides in the brain, or does it? In this book, Imants Baruss and Julian Mossbridge utilize findings from quantum mechanics, special relativity, philosophy, and paranormal psychology to build a rigorous scientific investigation into the origins and nature of human consciousness. Along the way, they examine the scientific literature on concepts such as mediumship, out-of-body and near-death experiences, telekinesis, apparent versus deep time, and mind-to-mind communication. And they introduce eye-opening ideas about our shared reality. The result is a revelatory tour of the post-materialist world and a roadmap for consciousness research in the 21st century. So I am going to get out of the way, and the floor is yours.
Great. Imants, shall we dance?
Sure.
The last fall.
Yeah, exactly. So we had talked, Imants and I had talked ahead of time about which of these questions we wanted to answer first. And shall we start with what motivated us and what was the process of crafting the book?
That sounds like a great idea.
That was your idea. But yes, it is a great idea. So, do you want to start with what motivated you, or should I start with what motivated me? It's pretty similar, I think.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about doing some work on time together and writing a paper about time. And
yeah, that's right.
That's how it actually, the beginning was thinking about time. And I wanted to think about time for many years already. I just hadn't had time to sit down and do it. It's really pivotal, I think, for understanding what is actually going on in reality. And
well, yeah, in fact, maybe it can't be separated from conscious experience itself.
And so somehow we got into this idea, well, why don't we just write a whole book about consciousness? And so that's how it all started, really.
Yeah, it started that way. But then I remember you came to me and you said, look, I've got this relationship with the people at APA. They love me. They want me to write another book. And would you write it with me? And you said, and I said, yeah, that sounds really exciting. What could we do? You know, that would be sort of passable through the APA because it's, the premier publisher of psychology textbooks in the U.S. And so sort of wondering what could get past them. And Imants, you were pretty bold and you said, well, why don't we just write exactly what we want to say? And what if this were the book that just allowed us to say whatever it was that we felt was true, and we took all the data that we knew about and that we could find related to consciousness, and we really tried to understand what that data in an even-handed way, without the biases of materialism, what those data are pointing towards. And I said, yeah, that sounds incredibly exciting. Do you think they'd buy it? And you're like, sure. So you were right. And so that was exciting.
I think it's a tribute, really, to the integrity of the American Psychological, at least American Psychological Association books. You have to realize that American Psychological Association books has an arm's length relationship with the American Psychological Association. They have for obvious reasons, they have a certain degree of academic freedom to do what it is that they want. And so I think it is a tribute to their integrity, to the integrity of the editors, that they were willing to support this project. Now, I should say that they published my book in 2003, Alterations of Consciousness. And the book did really well. Like, it had very good reviews, and it sold over 4,000 copies. A lot of that to my students. So they had a history of knowing that I did careful work. And so I think that when we came forward with the proposal for this book, which is basically, we were just going to say, we're going to set aside the materialist assumption and just look at the evidence and see where it leads us, then I think that they were willing to listen, and they were interested in seeing what we could come up with. So we actually, we sent in a prospectus for the book. We hadn't written a single word. And they put it through the review process, through their editorial process, and sent us a contract. And so I think that that's also very important, because once you have a publishing contract and you know who you're writing for, who's going to be publishing it, how they're going to go about doing it, and so on, then you can really focus on the content of the book to reach the people that you're trying to reach. And so we really wrote the book.
That's true. That's very free.
We wrote the book really with the knowledge that it would go out to ordinary psychologists and mental health professionals as sort of the targeted population for the book. And so what we did was we tried to say, okay, like, we're reasonable people, and let's look at this evidence together, and let's see what we can make of it, without without assuming at the outset that materialism is a correct interpretation of reality. So that was really the starting point for writing the book.
Yeah, and in terms of what motivated us, I mean, we've both spent many years, Imants, many more years than myself, fighting bias schemata that various people in academia have had in response to data that we've put forward or ideas that we've put forward. And it gets frustrating when you start to see this sort of science treated as a religion, as if it has right answers, even despite the presence of data or ideas that are flying in the face of those dogmatic answers. And so that was the motivation, was just saying, also not only to put a rethinking of the science of consciousness out there. There are plenty of other people who have written books like that, but to put it out there as in a textbook format for psychologists, clinical psychologists, experimental psychologists, neuroscientists, but also so that we can model that for people to say on sort of both sides of the debate about materialism. So there's certainly people on the post-materialist side who tend to ignore data that support the relationship between brain and mind. And there are certainly people on the materialist side, we all know, who ignore data that support that there is not always a tight relationship between brain and mind. And so trying to vary, this also gets into crafting the book. Imants and I were very careful around trying to be conscious to the extent that we could of our own biases so that we could actually fairly evaluate the data and present what we thought was closest to a good fit in terms of theory with the data. So when Carlos asks, was there any resistance from the APA editors? Not much. I mean, they asked the editors not at all. One of the editors asked a reviewer to review it who was slightly skeptical of something, some elements of it, and it turned out that was helpful in shaping the way we talked about certain topics, and we put a few more hedge words in there. So we made a lot of statements in there around something like, if this were true, then we would. It's hard to argue with a statement like that because someone could just say, well, I don't believe that's true. But if it's true, then what follows is clear. So, hey, Imants, do you want to, before we get to Sheila's question, do you want to?
Yeah, just to sort of, it might be worth saying a tiny bit more about that. Basically, the reviewer was concerned about moving into sort of macro phenomena and talking about sort of the more dramatic kinds of anomalous phenomena that are associated with consciousness, and that could detract from the potential power that the book could have for showing people that anomalous phenomena are occurring. So basically just stick to the lab evidence. And we thought it was very important to just be honest and say, yes, there are also field studies. We can't ignore these. We need to look at these. And they complement what we find in the lab. And so I think that for us, one of the things that we were very conscious of doing was of not following other people's agendas and of not being put into you shouldn't go there because people won't react properly to you, or, that we should be afraid. We should be afraid of what people will say. And so I think for us it was just, no, we're going to say what we feel is important to say, and we're going to base everything on the empirical evidence and with keeping in mind what the quality of it is, pointing out what the quality of it is as we go along, and what makes sense rationally and reasonably. When you stop genuflecting to materialism. So if you simply look at what's there and talk about it, then we're going to talk about anything that we find or that we come across. And we're not going to limit ourselves just because people say we should be afraid. So our attitude was one of, we're not interested in being afraid. We're interested in moving forward and doing science the way science was intended to be done, and we're simply going to do it, and we're going to stand by it.
Yes, and I think that the fear piece relates to the shame piece. And so my experience in academia and trying to get a tenure-track position in academia is so many people told me if I just took certain things off my resume, I could get a tenure-track position because my resume, and they meant this as a compliment, your resume is just fine without those things, therefore you should take them off because they make people, think that you're crazy, right? Because you have papers in there about predicting the future and such, right? And so for a while it worked, and I didn't take them off my resume, but I considered it, and then I got clear that that was about one of the ways that people who are in a worldview that is insular, sort of like a cult, keep other people in the cult is to shame them for attempting to leave the cult. And shame works because if you don't know of any other way to feel good about yourself except to be in the cult, then you're afraid of being kicked out, right? And I could feel that in myself personally. So I had to notice that and say, wait a minute, is this a cult I want to be in? Do I want to be in a cult at all? and just recognizing like, no, the why I fell in love with science in the first place is it's the opposite of a cult. It's a process. It's a verb. It's changing. It's about the unknown. It's about rigorously investigating the unknown, and that's what I wanted to do. And so if academia wasn't about doing that, I didn't want to have a tenure-track position at all. And that's where I went with it. Hey, Imants, we got asked a question by Sheila in the UK about she's going to do a summary of our book for a group of people she's working with, and she's wondering about what she can tell people in terms of developing psi abilities, and I thought that might be a good opportunity to answer this question about summarizing the content of the book. Are you open to going there?
Sure, yeah, I'm open to all kinds of things.
Okay, cool. So I'll try to summarize, and then Imants, you want to tell me where I messed up?
Sure. Let me get a paper and pencil here.
Oh no, you're writing it down. Okay, here we go. This is me from memory. So in the first section of the book, the first chapter of the book is largely a takedown of materialism and just the logic of why we don't think it's a good explanation based on the data. That's, to me, one of my favorite parts of the book because it explains clearly and logically the thinking around that. And then once that's done, then the rest of the book, the middle section of the book is about, okay, here are these chunks of different kinds of data that we're using to think about the science or rethink about the science of consciousness. So one chunk of data is shared mind, examples of telepathy, or the long body, as Native Americans would say. Extended mind is another way to say it. Transcendent mind is another way to say it. In other words, some kind of access to information that goes beyond the personal or the physical boundaries that we have. Another chunk of evidence is around time and precognition and changes of time when people are in altered states of consciousness. And another chunk of data is around the relationship between the mind and the body, and how sometimes when the body or the brain, body/brain, are compromised, you even get more access to mind somehow. And so what does that mean? Well, it suggests that the brain isn't in charge of the whole relationship between the brain and the mind. We talk about talking to getting information from discarnate entities and what that tells us about the survival of consciousness, if anything. And we talk about, let's see, those are the things I remember. Imants, what am I missing?
You're missing
time. No, I talked about.
We said a little bit about time. It's PK, direct influence of mind.
Oh yes. Yes. Can we directly use our minds to influence matter? So that's like the middle of the book. And then towards the end, the last two chapters are about, okay, so given that consciousness doesn't help very much to think about consciousness as this material phenomenon, how do we move forward in our, so what? Like, what do we do as psychologists, neuroscientists, experimentalists? What do we do? How do we move forward? What are the rules of engagement? How do we combine subjective experiencing with objective observations so that we can really understand consciousness? And also, what do we need to know as clinicians as we move forward? And what is our model of consciousness anyway? Towards the very end, Imants and I try to go out on a limb and sort of assert a model of consciousness that in about 30 seconds could be disputed, but we kind of know that, and we're putting it out there just to have something out there that could actually be tested and refuted, and then we can get something better. So, what do you think, Imants? What am I?
I think it's good. I think just a couple things. Okay, one of the things just in terms of content, I think the time chapter, we really did think carefully about time. And because we were bringing in data from the phenomenology of time, from neuroscience of time, from altered states, anomalous phenomena regarding time, I don't know that anyone else, and physics, of course. The whole first part is...
Yeah. Started off with physics.
Yeah. So I think that I'm not sure that anyone else has actually tried to do that. And I think we actually do a reasonably good job of it. And so...
No, it's one of my favorite chapters.
So, in a way, like the time chapter and a little bit of the theory maybe in chapter 8, although a lot of that is already grounded in the time chapter. Like, the time chapter is sort of our unique contribution to moving this forward. In a way, I see the rest of the book as a summary of the existing evidence, whereas the time chapter is a place where we really contribute, I think, to the discussion, particularly of time with respect to consciousness.
Well, I think so. I think maybe, but I also think chapter 7, where we're talking about first, third person methods of approaching consciousness is really, it has been said before, but I think that the way that we say it is really compelling and important. And we give basic tips and advice for people who are in the field in terms of going forward and doing experiments and making inquiries in the field. And I think that's kind of unusual. So I think that's a good contribution.
Yes, I would say the whole book is like that. I'm using it as a textbook in my third year consciousness class, so I'm reading it now through the eyes of the students, and we're discussing a chapter a week. And we just finished chapter 5. We're on to chapter 6, and it really struck me how well we've integrated material and how clearly we've presented it. So I feel that it's not just chapter 7 that does that. I feel that all of the chapters really do that in a very effective way. And the students are very, first of all, they're not having any difficulty understanding any of them. Some of the physics, but that's understandable. But they're not really having any difficulty understanding the line of reasoning. And there is a very clear line of reasoning that we take through the book. And they're on side. They're all on side. Like, they all understand. They go, yes, this is the way it is. Like, why doesn't everybody understand this? I mean, I think it's, when you lay it out clearly like that, then you can see, okay, now we're having a slightly better way of understanding what's happening in reality.
Well, that's really cool. I'm glad that your students are doing that. Mostly the people who comment to me about it are people in my family. My whole family's reading it, and I get these texts like, "Well, but if time doesn't exist, then blah blah blah." I'm like, "Oh no!" But I wanted to speak to this question that Sheila asked about psi and what we would recommend about the training of psi. In the book, Imants, in the book, we don't really recommend anything about the training of psi, but we make some comments about correlations that have been seen, right? So there isn't much known about the training of psi, and there's a lot of guessing around how to make people better at it. And there's certainly an array of ability. It seems to be that there's an array of natural ability, just like with any talent. So there's some people who are really great musicians out of the box, and you can train them and they get even better. And there's some people who are not very good musicians, and when you train them, they can get good, but they don't get amazing. And there's some people who aren't very good at musicians, and you train them and they can actually get amazing. So there's a whole array of combinations of nature and nurture vis-a-vis psi, in the same way as there is for music. And I mean, that's my assumption, and that's based on just talking to people in the field. There's not a lot of psi training data out there, except for some failures. I did an experiment in which I tried to train people in explicit psi. Specifically psi is, what I mean by psi is any kind of interaction with the world that is outside of the material explanation of consciousness. So, for instance, psychokinesis, mind over matter, or precognition, or clairvoyance, or telepathy, or mediumship. And so anyway, I tried to train people in explicit psi. So explicitly, tell me what image do you think is about to appear, and they essentially got worse. So my sense is from that, and then doing some reading in the literature around and doing more experiments around at least precognition, and then also looking into the telepathy literature, and then looking at the PK literature. It seems to me that the explicit, deliberate, putting all your focus of attention, getting very serious about it approach is the opposite of the approach that works. So maybe the playful, out of the corner of your eye, having fun, not taking it too seriously, letting part of yourself that doesn't always get out to play. Maybe there's something in there for people who are trying to train psi. And the other piece of it that I've been playing with in terms of trying to train myself in explicit psi, I try to do it non-deliberate explicit. In other words, I'm still asking myself the question, what image is about to appear? But I am asking it as I do another task. So it's like a dual task. So most of my attention is on something else, and then every once in a while I ask myself, and I try to be as non-deliberative as possible. And if you're interested in training yourself on psi, there's a couple apps you could look at. So one is out there, it's Russell Targ's app called the ESP Trainer, which you can get on the I think it's iTunes, maybe also Android, I'm not sure. And then I'm actually coming out with an app designed by Dean Radin and myself from the Institute of Noetic Sciences called PsyQ, which will be coming out for iPhones and potentially soon after for Android, probably sometime in November. No, wait, it's November, December or January. So shoot me an email if you want more information about that, and I can send that to you. But training yourself on psi is like developing this beautiful, to me, like a collaboration between your unconscious mind and your conscious mind, so that you can. It's like here's the way I see it. The job of the unconscious mind is to gather all the data. If you read Jim Carpenter's First Sight, you'll get a lot of more information about how the unconscious mind is gathering all these data. And then the conscious mind culls from the data and makes a decision. And what you want is your conscious mind to not work against the unconscious mind. You want your conscious mind to work with it instead of pushing it out of the way. And the more we decide that materialism, the more, as Imants says, we bow down to materialism, the more that pushes the unconscious out of the way, because you're not allowed to have any access to information except for through your five senses. So those are some words about training psi. Imants, what do you think of that?
Oh, I think that's great. But to make it clear to people that we don't talk about any of that in the book. Like the book, I mean, that'll be another book. But here's the thing, that clearly what we talk about has practical implications. And so we kind of like take people up to the point where, yeah, okay, it has practical implications, and then we kind of like leave them sort of stranded. And this kind of came up for me this week because in her 1-minute essay, one of the students in the class said that now that she understands that discarnate entities can actually be around and that they can, in some cases, pop into people's bodies and out again and so on, now she's afraid that might happen to her. So then the question is, so how do you deal with that? Well, we don't hold anybody's hand in the book. We just lay it all out. This is the research. This is what it says. This is what's happening. And now what do you do? So I think that there's a real need to address that. The other thing about this kind of like just training for psi, and I know people who actually do those kinds of things, like train for mediumship or train for different kinds of psychic abilities, and one of the things that, especially when we talk about training for mediumship, one of the things they leave out is the dark side. Because as soon as you have access to something more, you realize you have access to something more, then it's not all going to be rosy. I mean, some of it is downright nasty. And people need to understand that. And there needs to be some kind of guidance or instruction or some kind of preparation for people who are deliberately trying to unfold these abilities as to what they can expect to run into and how to deal with anything problematic that comes up. So I think that is a really important issue, actually, one that we don't address in the book, but one that I think needs to be addressed. You want to write another book, Julia?
Yeah, well, we'll talk about that offline, but it's not I think it's really important, although writing about the dark stuff, sounds heavy. But you're right, it does.
You can't avoid heaviness. I mean, as a country, the United States experienced heaviness this week. So it's not like you can avoid having to deal with the shadow, with the downside, with nastiness, with outright meanness, and so on. I mean, those are things that we need to learn how to deal with. We have ways
just
trying
hard to motivate
deal
myself
with in the usual world through the usual sensory modalities, but we also have to deal with them in the non-usual sensory modalities.
Yes, I agree.
I know you agree. I just thought, for the sake of people listening, that I thought it was important to sort of to say a few more words about that, just to show that is a reality that people have to deal with.
Yes, I agree. And I do think that what Carlos says is that the dark side is all around us and it can be controlled. I agree with that too. The Jedi approach makes sense to me. But someone asked a question about physics and what types of thinking in physics are most useful for understanding sort of our model of, or what we came out with in terms of our rethinking of consciousness here. I mean, I kind of want to say all of them because even though there's a rift between, special relativity and quantum mechanics, we think about both. It's just useful to know the basic foundations. But the thing is that you have to know about physicists is good luck getting any kind of consensus from physicists. I mean, really, we asked a bunch of physicists about the time chapter, and some of them think, oh, time is, just complete illusion, and others are like, yeah, time is essential and it's foundational. And so there's a real revolution going on in physics right now, with 18 or more different interpretations of quantum mechanics that have completely different implications. So I don't know what to say about physics. I think we're going to start telling the physicists what's going on with their equations, because they don't have any foundations for quantum mechanics. I mean, it's simply empirical. What are you thinking about?
I should maybe, just for readers who don't know my background, I started out in engineering and I took physics courses as well at the University of Toronto. I went on to do a master's degree in mathematics, although it was in mathematical logic, which is actually a very helpful thing to do. Then about 8 years ago during my sabbatical, I sat in on a quantum mechanics course and a senior graduate applied math course in quantum field theory for cosmology. So I kind of upgraded my understanding of quantum theory in those kinds of ways. I think trying to answer the question directly, like what kind of physics, what should we be looking at when we look at physics for better understanding consciousness? I think, I don't mean to sound pessimistic, because I think that it is worth trying to understand what one can about how physicists see the world and the kinds of insights they have about the world. But just from my own experience and in talking to physicists, knowing physicists, and having some view of the world of physics, it's very, very difficult to do all of that without the backbone of mathematics, so that you can interpret and understand the equations and the mathematical structures for yourself. Because for physicists, the understanding is the mathematics, and then trying to interpret the mathematics, well, then they usually don't even try. And so the people who do try, for instance, are philosophers. But I found in my experience with them that they don't understand the physics well enough very often to interpret it very well. The other part of it is, as Julia pointed out, physics today is truly all over the place. And I mean, I think it's very difficult to understate just how all over the place it is. And trying to keep track of who's saying what and where they're going and how they're doing what and why they think what is monumentally difficult. It's a full-time job, and you do need the math background in order to be able to do it. The other thing that I found is that a lot of the sort of quantum mind stuff, and I think I've published 5 or 6 papers about quantum mind, that a lot of the quantum mind stuff is, well, that's even more all over the place than physics itself, if that's even possible. Quantum Mind conference I was at the University of Salzburg, everybody was going madly off in all directions by themselves. And it was very, very difficult for people to talk to one another because they were not just on separate pages, they were in different boats going into different places. So I think that the best that one can do is just to try to understand some of the core concepts in physics and the ideas that have come up in physics. And I think we present some of those in the book as to their implications for understanding reality and for consciousness. So for instance, just a very simple idea that fundamental particles or elementary particles do not have continuous existence. And that is accepted even by people who would tend towards materialism. So then you have to try to reconstitute some kind of continuously existing matter out of things that you already know aren't continuously existing. So I think that those kinds of ideas, like being exposed to them and understanding them, can be helpful for understanding reality and consciousness without knowing the math. But to try to really go into where it's all going today, or who's saying what or something, I think is very difficult.
Yep, I agree. It's a crazy world, and as a non-physicist, trying to get a grip on it is much more difficult than a physicist. But at the same time, as a physicist, tend to take sides pretty quickly, and maybe I'm a little less siloed because I'm not a physicist. So maybe there is an advantage to looking at things from outside, although grasping the mathematics is important.
Well, I think Julia and I think we discussed this as we were writing the book, and in Chapter 8 we actually criticized physicists for failing to take into account data that they should be taking into account in any physical theory of the universe. And it's very true that despite the fact that they're going all over the place, there are still even there are these silos, and there are huge silos around trying to deal with some of the data that we're talking about. So just to give one very simple example of that, the discovery of the Higgs boson, I don't know if Julia is as well, but I'm convinced it's a PK effect. It has nothing to do with the actual fundamental nature of reality. And if you look at...
We should talk about why. We should talk about those two methods.
Yeah, I think that might take us too far afield, I think, for right now. But, I mean, we can if we want to. But I think that But the point I was making here is that I've talked to physicists about this, even ones who respect me, and they kind of, like the ones who respect me just kind of go, okay, yeah, but it doesn't go anywhere. And others just don't even respond. Like they have nothing to say because that spoils their game. I mean, one of the fundamental rules of their game is that they're looking at an objective reality and they're trying to figure out what that is. And if you suddenly say, well, the Higgs boson, you made that. I mean, that was a configuration of the measuring equipment that has nothing to do with what physical reality actually looks like, then they can't, that's not their game anymore. Like they can't go there. So.
Yes, I think that's a really important piece to keep in mind. So when you're interacting with physicists, remember that we all have built-in from childhood this experience that physics is on the top of the pyramid, right? Math and physics is on the top of the pyramid of status, right? And so we tend to, certainly as a scientist, I was raised that way. And my father was a physicist, so I definitely heard from him about how everything was based on physics. But when I would challenge, for instance, my father around certain things, around the subjective nature, for instance, of the second law of thermodynamics, because no one can really define what disorder is. In fact, disorder is a very human concept that is very subjective. He would get flustered because I think there's something really ingrained in physicists where they are not in the story. They are looking at the story unless you're doing some sort of quantum mechanics that includes the observer. But for the most part, physicists like to keep out of the story, and there's something gratifying about that for them. And yeah, I agree. It's definitely challenging to talk to them about that. You know, Imants, there was a question here. I'm trying to scroll up on the chat bar, so where was it? Oh, microtubules and consciousness. And we don't talk much about that, or I don't think we even cite Penrose and Roger Penrose. And someone asked a question about sort of why.
When the theory was first published, I believe in 1996 in the Journal of Consciousness Studies, one of my colleagues, John Bell, who was a mathematician here at Western University, he and I sat down and we examined the theory very carefully over the course of a number of hours. And there were so many serious flaws in it that we decided that it was not worth trying to fix it or talk about it. So ever since that time, I've just kind of let it go wherever it goes and not worry about it.
Yeah. And I guess my take-home message, the thing I like to take away from the Hammer-Penrose model is not the model in particular, but this idea that quantum-like behavior can exist in the brain. And that I think is being borne out by experiment and biological systems in general and in humans in particular, and also plants and birds. So the warm, wet environment of the brain turns out to be a place that actually can sustain some quantum-like behavior. So there's two questions, Imants, that we ought to address here. One is, Margaret asked, doesn't the Higgs boson supposedly give things mass, so how is that PK? I'm going to briefly describe the PK version of the Higgs boson, and then will you correct me, Imants, if I'm wrong, or add?
Go for it.
Go. Okay. So one of the interesting things, if you ever, maybe you've watched the documentary, what is that, the particle documentary called? Particle Fever?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So they talk about
that's the one in which
Yeah.
Tell her to watch that and then she'll understand.
Yeah, if you watch that, what you'll see is there's sort of two groups of physicists who are in two different camps. And one believes that the mass of the Higgs boson should be here on the scale, and another believes the mass should be here. And what happens is the mass that is calculated ends up almost exactly in the middle.
No,
and so this is the thing sort of...
Julian, no.
I got it wrong.
No.
Good.
What happened was they ended up finding the mass that one of the groups predicted.
I thought it was in the middle.
Wait. Yes. that one of the groups predicted. So at like 6 sigma or something like that, or like they have these exaggerated levels of statistical significance. And then, so what happened was the people in the other camp said, well, my whole career was a waste. Like, there goes my life kind of thing. And they were all upset. So then a few months later, the people at the Large Hadron Collider, they said, oh, wait, no. We made a mistake. We didn't find it at all. And then another couple of years goes by. They fix the machine and so on, upgrade it, whatever they did. And then they come out and they say, okay, now we have the mass of the Higgs boson, and they plop it between the two camps. That's where it was between the two camps. So this is the whole thing is a joke. And I talked to physicists. I said, give us access to the Large Hadron Collider, and we will create a particle. Like we will predict a particle, a completely fictional particle, like Philip the imaginary ghost, right? Like we're going to create a completely fictional particle. We're giving it like 100 gig electron volts mass or something, and spin of such and such and all the rest of it. And then we're just going to get like people, who have these abilities, or we think have these abilities. We'll just get them to give us like a set period of time on the Large Hadron Collider, and we'll create your particle for you. But they haven't taken me up on that. Sure. We just finished that on Wednesday in my class. So I'm all warmed up. What we do, basically, in that chapter, we start, like there are kind of like, we take 3 sort of steps off the deep end, kind of, like, or steps into the deep end, I suppose. So the first step is, what happens when the brain is seriously compromised? And so we look at terminal lucidity, which is a phenomenon. People have started writing about it recently. It's been in the medical literature for a long time, but somebody with Alzheimer's disease who has been mute for a year, hasn't been responsive to anything, suddenly sits up, recites a poem in Icelandic, recognizes her son, and then, falls back down and dies a month later.
Suspicions, maybe.
So here you see
unusual people are wanting us to tell the story of
lucidity,
cognitive
capability,
I guess,
which is not predicted
as opposed to the words in the book, which are also our own words, but they're in the book. But just to talk a little bit more about the Feynman, interaction we had, which was kind of fun.
That's sort of mind in a compromised brain. Then we go to mind in a silent brain, and we look at some of the accounts.
You were the one who started it, and then I'll go into my piece, and then we can sort of tell it as it was.
Near-death experiences, and those are becoming. Those are simply like we're getting more and more of those types of accounts now from reputable surgeons who were present when these things happen. And then the third step, which is kind of the like that would be kind of like stepping off the deep end, is, well, okay, what if there's no brain at all? And now we're back into the mediumship research, and we're trying to look at what kind of consensus arises from the communication, the purported communication with discarnates through different modalities, mediumship, ITC, and so on, as to what mind might be like in an afterlife. Like, and one of the things that one of my students pointed out, that I think we probably do that in the book as well, but it kind of just came from a different angle at me, that the separation of the mind from the brain is already predicted by a lot of the non-local activity of the mind in terms of both input, so clairvoyance, telepathy, and so on, and output, PK, poltergeist.
Well, one thing I said is that, it's weird that when my son keeps complaining of the smells of smoke.
There's a continuity of...
No one smokes in our house.
There's a continuity of theme
very sensitive.
here.
And then I started
sort of separation of mind from brain chapter,
in our car.
and you've already got this expanded mind.
And so this was around the time that Imants was smelling it, and I thought that's weird. And, my son has this interesting relationship to physics, which is that he
So that's
doesn't
kind of
ever
like a
open
very
his physics textbook,
short,
but when he does physics tests,
short
he kind of
synopsis of
he's
how
like, I don't know how I get the answers,
structure
but
the
they come to me
chapter,
and they're
and then
always
we bring
different
in the
from the
evidence
way
that
that the teacher
pertains to
says to
each
calculate
part,
things. So he's got some
and do
relationship
the
to
best we
physics,
can at evaluating
and
it
so I thought that's
and
interesting.
trying to draw some sort of
And
reasonable, I'm not even
anyway,
sure they're conclusions, but
I
reasonable
said
things
to
you can say
Imants,
about
well,
it.
God, if you've got Richard Feynman, ask him some questions
Yeah.
that are really technical that only he would know the answer to, because otherwise she could be, Googling him or whatever. I mean, who knows, right? It's tempting to think it's Richard, but let's ask something very specific. And then Imants said,
Sure. Do you want me to start? I guess I started it. I was, as those listening to this might, well, just a little bit of background that wasn't in the book. I was on my way to hot yoga one night when I smelled cigarette smoke in my car. Not active cigarette smoke, but as though a heavy smoker were sitting beside me. Actually, by the way, it's not clear just to what extent Richard Feynman did smoke, but I associated this smoke and smoking with Richard Feynman. And the same thing happened the next day driving home from school. And so I wondered whether Richard Feynman was hanging around, and asked Angie Aristone, who is a medium, who I know, who has
and
done
remember,
research
Imants
with
has
me in
his
the
background in
past,
physics, so of course I'm always
to
one
come
step
over.
behind.
So she
So I'm
came
like,
over
well,
and
what
she
the hell
got
is the
him.
fine
She got him
structure
right
constant?
away.
So
And
as
she was
he's
able
talking, I'm
to
Googling fine structure constant. And I find this article
get
on
accurate
Richard
information
Feynman
about
in Wikipedia.
his appearance and his mannerisms
And
all sorts of things. The
I
fact
read,
that he
just as
died
Imants is telling me
21
about
of
this
his
story, and
years
I
ago,
read it, and
which
I
is not
see that,
something
wait
that
a
is
minute,
commonly
he's talking
known.
about a fine structure constant, but he doesn't say it's
And so I told all that to
137
Julia,
or
and
whatever it
then
is that other people
Julia
are saying.
said,
He's saying it's 08 something, 0.08 something, which is the square root of that number, if I remember correctly. And I'm messing around on my calculator to verify this. And then I'm about to tell him about this, but then the line goes dead, which has never happened to us in our conversations before. It just that happened with that moment. And then so he calls me back, and he's got the call. Yeah.
so then I did. So the next time she came over, and she had no preparation for this. She didn't know that I was going to pop these physics questions at her. So the first was I asked her for the eightfold path, which kind of, I should have taken her up on it because there was a drawing that he was showing her, and I should have said draw it. But I didn't. So the second question was, what is the value of the fine structure constant? And so she sort of looks off into space and says, 0, 8, and I go, no, that's wrong. Yeah, you got it wrong. That's the wrong number. It's not right. So I just kind of like shut her off, so she gets, okay, now I just get dead air, nothing, So on the phone, I'm telling Julia, about this miss. So yeah, I asked her about the fine structure constant, and it was the wrong number. I was waiting for 137 or 1 over 137, or which would be like 0.007 something, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So it's interesting because to me it was validating. I mean, I've had experiences with mediums that are validating, but to me it was validating in the context of what we were writing about, because we were just working on that chapter. And also, mediums generally try to do two things, right? Besides help people. To get to the place where they can help people, they want to first
before the line went
convince
dead,
you that they're actually talking to the person.
I told Julia, I didn't get it. I didn't get what Julia was saying. So I just thought,
they want to
like,
give
whatever,
information.
it's not.
The departed person
this
seems
is
to
it.
want
Like,
to
I
give
put it on my mind,
information
like, forget it.
that only they would know.
Myth.
So they want to seem to
When
verify
a medium
that
gets
that's
a myth,
them. And
a
so
medium
this
gets
is
a myth, and
Richard
that's it.
Feynman
We're
answering
moving
the
on,
question, which
and
very few people actually know the answer to off the top of their head. And Angie did not. She was sitting there right with Imants, so she couldn't Google it or anything.
So I call her back,
So he's giving that answer, but he's giving
So
it
I
an
call
answer
her
in the way,
back,
specifically the way that
and
he would give
she
the
says,
answer.
"Oh, there's
So it
08
does two
on
things
the
at the same
on
time.
my
This is a physicist. This is
calculator."
not the medium, and
And she
this is
punched
Richard
in, and I
Feynman.
go, "Oh wait, of course."
So we ought to go
of
back
course.
and ask him some
Square
questions
root.
if we can tolerate it.
So what he's saying is he doesn't want to go with all the rest of these physicists.
Let's
He
see,
doesn't
any other
agree with them.
questions?
He
I
thinks
guess
he
we have
wants
to
the
wind
value of the
down
Feynman structure
soon.
constant to be the square root. And so I think
Do we want to answer
if
the
there
what's
is a
next
Richard
question?
Feynman out there somewhere, he had a good laugh. And it's also interesting. It's also interesting that
Nancy says that
that
we have about 3
the
minutes
Feynman
to
structure
wind it
constant
down.
was something
so
I was
the 3
going to
minutes,
ask
can we
about
talk
because
about
I
what's
couldn't
next?
even remember what it was. Like I don't know how it popped into my head in the first place. I thought, well, what kind of things should I ask? Well, I'll ask about the Feynman structure constant. So, it could have been Richard Feynman all along. And, the other thing that happened is I was telling someone else on the phone about this, Richard Feynman episode, and the phone went dead. And I said, oh, I wonder if that's Richard Feynman. So then I tried to call back and I couldn't. Then I tried again and I finally got back.
To me,
so
what's
it was
next
like
is I'm really working
basically
on
the
now
third
it feels like
time
the
or
work
fourth
is even
time or
more
something that I got back.
heavy.
Then I
important.
called
I'm
Angie
really
in
working on
to
shifting
ask her about that. Was that
Silicon
Richard
Valley
Feynman?
and
And she said,
corporate
yeah. He
America
said
in
he
general
cut out the
towards
phone. He said he did it
unconditional
3 times.
love.
I hadn't said anything about the fact that I couldn't get
Yeah,
back
no,
on
right?
afterwards. He said it's easy to
Holy
do.
shit. And
So there you have it.
No, it's not like these things just come to me and now I'm screwed, right? But anyway, yeah, that seems to be what I'm working on, and also just how you could accessing unconditional love as a way to get access to psi abilities and other kinds of any kind of intuitive abilities and manifestation abilities. That it's almost like I am starting to think more along the lines of like the Jedi, right? It's like the accessing the Force, but the Force is unconditional love. And once you have that, you not only have unconditional love, but you have access to all these other abilities that can actually help shift the world so the world doesn't get destroyed by nuclear weapons or environmental degradation. So that's where I'm at. And then maybe Imants and I will write this book on the dark side, and maybe that could actually help deal with some of the Trump stuff.
What's next?
Yes, and I hope that we can, and I hope that with everyone who's listening, because everyone who's listening is also really interested in these kind of efforts. And
I wrote another book,
possible, right? I mean, because the fact that we can say these words suggests.
And
that
one of the
this is
things that I'm really concerned about is environmental degradation.
So there you go.
Well,
and
yes,
well,
human existence because of
nothing
Transcendent
negative
Mind.
about previous speakers,
so I'm
but
gonna write
oh my
another
God, this
chapter
is my favorite one so far in
in the
all our
meantime.
3 series.
Your turn.
Really
Julie.
a marvelous presentation, and the back and forth was great. The discussion of the book was great, and handling the students as we went along was terrific. So this is boy, oh boy, this was a really good one. I'm so glad that you both could join us today. Thank you again, and I'd like to remind everybody that you can download this PowerPoint. It is in the class on the schedule page, and that will give you live links. And I have just this second copied the chat, which is important, and that will be up in the class schedule page as well, if not before the next session, then a little bit later.
What I failed to mention
our
is
next
that
session
what
is
I'm
at
doing in
2
this
p.m.
book is I'm arguing for how we need to use these non-local properties of consciousness as a way of trying to change the situation.
Which is a survey of 100
Julian and I are on the same page
very, very good
which
near-death
of course
experience
doesn't surprise me, but I also
reports
think
that
it's
include
kind of
verified
interesting that,
paranormal phenomena.
like
So
after
it's
this
very,
book,
very
it's not
interesting.
as
It was
though we
supported
kind of
by
like just
the
went,
International
oh, that was
Association
nice,
for
now I can,
Near-Death
you know, have a picture
So
or
thank you
something.
again, Julian.
But, you know,
this has been
even
fantastic.
more dramatic,
I think
like,
everybody really enjoyed it, and I know
mania
Carlos and I
takes
did
over.
keep waking his mother up laughing.
We're gonna have unconditional
So-
love in Silicon Valley. I'm gonna
working
stop
out
you.
well.
That's good.
So thank you from all of us, and thank you from the Parapsychology Foundation, and I'm closing off the class now, and we'll see you in the next one at 2 p.m.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Thanks,
Bye, Mom.
everybody.
Hi there, I'm Lisette Coley. I'm president of Parapsychology Foundation, so welcome to our YouTube channel. We have lots to look at, so please check out our videos. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.